Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by Go Collect. And if you're interested, head over to Reggie Collects here on YouTube. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another episode of the Go Collect Weekly Speculation Recap video. In this video, we are going to spend some time looking at 6 blog articles that have been submitted by bloggers all across the US into Go Collect. As a reminder, these blog posts are all linked in the description of this video, and I definitely want to encourage you to take some time to read these blog posts in their entirety, because I'm only going to be touching on high points of these different blog posts, along with adding some commentary of my own. Without any further ado, let's dig into the first blog post. There is a tremendous amount of speculation right now around any comic that is in any way, shape, or form tied to a movie, TV show, or streaming service. And there is a lot of speculative excitement around who might be the next on-screen villain to face off against Spider-Man. And there are people that believe that it's going to be Kraven, and there are others out there that say signs point to the Sinister Six. But in this first blog post from Ryan, he actually takes a slightly different approach, and he actually highlights 4 villains that will never be seen in any kind of movie associated with Spider-Man. And it's actually a pretty fun article that Ryan has actually put together, and it's entitled The Forgettable 4. Spider-Man's 4 worst villains. And so I want to take a couple of minutes here to highlight who these 4 villains are, what their first appearances are, and then what's happening with those first appearances. The very first that we're going to talk about is the Finisher. The Finisher actually made his first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man Annual, and it appears that he was some kind of elite assassin that worked for the Red Skull. He faced off against Spider-Man, but he didn't last all that long. In fact, I think it was only 1 issue that he actually appeared in. Ryan points out in this article that if you want to own a copy of this special king-size book, it's unfortunately going to set you back several $100s for a high-grade CGC copy. This book also happens to be the first appearance of Peter Parker's parents, which is where I think a lot of the value actually comes from, not necessarily from the Finisher, again, one of Spider-Man's worst villains. The next character that Ryan highlights in his blog post is Silvermane. And Silvermane actually made his first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man number 73. And what was really cool about this is that Silvermane was actually a pretty powerful crime boss that was actually sent off to jail, and upon release returned back to New York to realize that his territory had essentially been taken over by the Kingpin. And so he creates some kind of serum using some things from Doc Connor to basically de-age himself. Only it goes a little too far, and he ends up basically disappearing in this issue. He does return in later issues of Amazing Spider-Man, but yeah, there you go. So unfortunately, Silvermane, Ryan points out, shares his first appearance with another more relevant villain, that being Man Mountain Marco. And he points out here that the current cost for a CGC 9.4 to 9.8 of Amazing Spider-Man number 73 is going to run somewhere between $250 all the way up to $1,000. And so this is actually a book that I own. I think it's actually a pretty cool book. The story arc that is involved here is actually a pretty fun read. So if you haven't read it, I definitely want to encourage you to actually check it out. The next villain that Ryan talks about is Big Wheel. Can't believe I actually said those words out loud related to a comic book, but Big Wheel is the next forgettable villain for Amazing Spider-Man. And Big Wheel is actually named Jackson. He appears in Amazing Spider-Man number 182 and 183. He's a corrupt businessman that mixes it up with Spider-Man and the Rocket Racer. And he basically works with the Tinkerer to create a big wheel that then rolls down the street into the Hudson River. Again, a forgettable character. But if you decide to pick up Amazing Spider-Man 182, you can actually get it pretty cheaply, even at a high grade, according to Ryan. He also points out that Amazing Spider-Man 182 is, yes, the first appearance of Big Wheel, but it is also the issue where Peter Parker actually proposes to MJ. And he actually points out here that you can get a 9.8 from CGC for less than $100. So definitely not a bad price to pay for a pretty forgettable character. The very last forgettable villain that Ryan talks about here is Screwball, and Screwball is a social media influencer that captures her escapades and I guess puts them on social media. Yeah, Amazing Spider-Man number 559 is the first appearance of Screwball, and you can actually pick these up relatively inexpensively. According to Ryan, you can buy these for around $50 at CGC 9.8. So there you have it. That is the first blog post, and again, I definitely want to encourage you to check it out in its entirety. Link in the description. So this next article from Michael is actually a pretty cool article. And it's cool because he actually points to the belief that the MCU is actually going to move in the direction of cosmic. And his premise here is that there are only so many stories that can be told on Earth with Earthlings. And he points out here in his article that there are cosmic threats that are always coming for us, artifacts of great power ready to be discovered, in alien beings looking to use Earth as a stepping stone for galactic domination. And he actually points out in this article that the quantum bands are one such artifact that represent a pretty powerful weapon. And his thought is that these quantum bands might actually fit into future MCU plans. And it's actually not a bad idea. He points out in this article, which is entitled Growing Pains from Marvel Boy to Quasar, he points out the evolution of basically Marvel Boy, who was Wendell Vaughn, who made his first appearance in Captain America 2017 in 1977. He talks about how he was introduced in that issue as Marvel Boy, went on to become Marvel Man, and then ultimately changed his name in Incredible Hulk 234 to Quasar. And it's really cool because here he points out that copies of Captain America 217 have been sought after as soon as they come to the market. And he highlights that a couple of 9.8 graded books that hit the auctions in the last few months have actually sold well above their FMV. The FMV for this book is only $550, but these copies actually sold for about $1,600 each. So there's definitely something going on there, and part of it might be the fact that when you look at the CGC census, there are only 19 copies at a 9.8, and so that could be part of what is driving up the price. If you are a fan of Quasar or Marvel Boy or Marvel Man, you might want to check out these two issues that are highlighted. And as a reminder, the link in this is in the description, so you definitely want to take some time to read this article in its entirety. So if you've been paying attention to any of the coverage of the recent box office attached to Birds of Prey, you know that this movie has not necessarily performed up to expectations. Regardless of whether you're talking about movie critics or if you're talking about what DC expected this movie to do, it is not performing as expected. And there are many reasons why this movie did not do well. And some of those reasons are actually explored in this blog post from Norman that is entitled Birds of a Feather Crash Together. sell Birds of Prey #1. He actually goes into some detail here where he says that whatever the reasons there are, one of the major drivers behind why this movie failed to perform might be the fact that there is a disconnect between the movie version of these characters and how they actually appeared in the comics. He says, worse yet, it could be that these characters do not represent their comic counterparts, not one whit. In my humble opinion, fans are very forgiving, but one thing they won't put up with is if the characters don't resemble their comic book counterparts. Can you say fire sale? He goes on in this article to basically say, you probably want to sell off anything related to Birds of Prey. He does, however, highlight that like Birds of Prey was actually a pretty cool comic book series, but because it wasn't adapted properly to the big screen, that might be one of the major reasons why this movie actually failed and why prices are starting to come down. And according to Norman, will hit rock bottom. So if you own Birds of Prey, you definitely want to check out this blog post, read it in its entirety, and figure out whether you need to dump these books. This next blog post is actually a pretty cool one in that it actually talks about 3 modern books that you might want to consider picking up. All 3 actually tie back to either Spider-Man or to Todd McFarlane. The very first book is Amazing Spider-Man #300, which is the first full appearance of the anti-hero known as Venom. The blogger points out that this month, this book actually only ranks 3rd on the list, but has actually been in the top 10 for the last 2 years, which signals that this book actually has some staying power. They actually point out that a 9.8 of this book actually sold recently for $2,000. A 9.2 sold for $376, and a graded 7.5 sold for $230. The next book on the list is Amazing Spider-Man #361. This is the first full appearance of Carnage, who recently made an appearance in a Sony movie, and I think is actually going to be coming back for another appearance in a future movie. While this book is popular, like Amazing Spider-Man 300, it doesn't have quite the same pull or fan following, which is actually reflected in the prices that you see for this book. A graded 9.8 only sells for about $305. A graded 9.6, $152, and a graded 8.5 actually sells for about $90. The very last book on this list, and again, ties directly back to Spider-Man to some degree or another, but also to Todd McFarlane, is Spawn #1. And the blogger actually points out that while this book is somewhat doing well now, and if you look at the data, it says that a 9.8 actually sold recently for $82, a 9.6 for $69, and a graded 8.5 for $30, they point out that just as recently as 2017, this book was selling for next to nothing. And so definitely a cautionary note here, but if Todd McFarlane is able to actually make that movie, then that you could see some resurgence in what happens with this particular book. Now, one thing that I will point out to you with this book is that there is an abundance of this book out there, that being Spawn #1, but you might want to consider getting the newsstand version, as that is a book that is not readily seen that often, and it also goes for a premium over the regular direct edition. And this book is actually easy to spot because it has a barcode right on the cover, whereas the direct doesn't. So we've been on a little bit of a theme for the course of this video, talking about speculation tied back to movies. So we might as well keep it going with this next article. And this blogger actually asked the question whether now is the time to pick up some of these first appearances, early appearances, important appearances of Rogue. And the very first book that they actually talk about is Avengers Annual #10. This is actually the first appearance of Rogue, where she actually showed up as a villain and as a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. The blogger points out in this article that only the 9.8 is really selling for high prices right now, saying that it averaged $372 for the last 90 days. And they go on to say that if you don't want to shell out that kind of money, $400 or so for a copy of this book, you can actually pick up a 9.6, which is going for roughly $125. So they point out that there is a lot of really awesome copies of this book that are available for not some terrible prices. So if you are into Rogue and believe that she may actually make an appearance in the MCU, you might want to look at this first appearance. Now, with that said, there's two other types of books that the blogger points out that I want to bring to your attention. The first one is the Uncanny X-Men number 158. And they point out here that 2 years after she debuted in Avengers Annual number 10, Chris Claremont actually wrote her into the X-Men title, and she debuted, as I mentioned, in X-Men number 158. And the prices for this book aren't crazy either. A 9.8 has a 90-day fair market value of $158, which is actually up $20, just $20 from 2018. And if you want something lower priced, there are lots of copies, as a 9.6 only sells for about $50. The very last book that I want to point out tied to Rogue is Uncanny X-Men number 171. And this is actually where she becomes a member, an official member of the X-Men. This book can actually go for only about $95 at a 9.8. But I have to point out that there have only been 3 sales of this book since the beginning of the year. So there you go. If you're into Rogue, if you believe that she has some potential in the MCU, you might want to take a look at these 3 books. So the very last blog post that we are going to look at asks the question of whether now is the time to pick up Cable's first appearance. And I am specifically talking about New Mutants number 87, which is the first appearance of the mutant known as Cable. The blogger points out in this article entitled "Cable TV is Dead, but Cable Comics Are Coming Alive." They point out that sales of New Mutants 87 were stagnant for approximately 18 months following the release of Deadpool. Prior to the movie, prices were actually spiking into the $400 range for direct edition comics, with newsstands going for roughly $600. They point out here that a newsstand copy recently sold for $500 and a direct copy is getting back into the $400 range for a 9.8 copy. And so it seems like what's happened is the book was performing really well. There's a little bit of a lull, and now things might be picking up. So they asked the question of whether now is the time to buy. And if you believe that Cable and Deadpool have a future in subsequent movies, now could be the time to pick up this book. So there you have it. Those are the 6 blog posts for this week's Go Collect Weekly Speculation video. As a reminder, the links are in the description of this video, and I definitely want to encourage you to check it out to read them in their entirety. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week.